Alright, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to History of Home Video Games Part 1, 1972 through 1983. My name is Eduardo Soliz. Somebody asked if I had any, game experience, and I said no, not outside of being somebody that played them. I was born in the early 70s, so I actually lived through some of this stuff growing up, so I can give you a little perspective on, what actually happened as opposed to, 20-year-old talking about video games that were made before you was even born. So yeah, let's go over our main topics for today, which are, first I will tell you about the father of video games, Baer. We'll go over the first generation of dedicated consoles, the very, very first home console, which was the Odyssey, Home Pong, and all the other flavors of Home Pong that were made over the years, or just a few. Then we'll get into our fun programmable consoles. This is where cartridges came into being. Channel F, Atari ECS, and television, Odyssey 2. And then, just like all good things, it all came tumbling down. In 1983, we'll go over the crash and the infamous ET thing that y'all have probably heard of. Good times. Alrighty, so let's talk about the world of 1972, which is now almost 50 years ago. First commercially available microprocessor was released in 1971 by Intel. A handheld scientific calculator. It wasn't even a scientific calculator. It added, it subtracted, it divided, and multiplied. $400, almost. Digital watches with red LEDs. They weren't even on all the time. They had a little button. You pushed the button, the LEDs told you the time. Came out. Super Bowl IV, 86,000 per ad. And the most depressing part, minimum wage was $1.60 or $12.06 in today's dollars. For perspective, a gallon of gas was 35 cents. So yeah, a long, long time ago. Yeah, digital was virtually non-existent at this point in time. Definitely not for the general public. So let's talk a little bit about technology. Integrated circuits, what everybody likes to call chips. What is a chip? A chip is a bunch of transistors put into a really small package. How small? Well, this is the original Odyssey hardware, the first video game system. You open up the box, that's what's inside all the electronics. A couple years after the Odyssey came out, a company took all this stuff and mashed it into one little chip. So yeah, you go from these guys to these guys. Integrated circuits also kind of got rid of vacuum tubes. So electronics got smaller, they used less power, it became cheaper, and all that good stuff thanks to integrated circuits. Okay, the father of video games, Baer, Rudolf Heinrich Baer, sadly passed away in 2014. He invented the brown box prototype, which would eventually become the Odyssey, the first home video system. In 1978, he also made the Sign electronic game. That's the hockey puck looking thing with the 4 lights and the tones. That is lots of fun, over 150 patents. Bunch of awards, really smart guy, did a lot of cool stuff. Alright, so first generation, dedicated consoles. These were consoles that only played the games that were hardwired into them. Games only had one screen. If you're lucky, you had sound, or even scoring. No CPUs. Everything was literally hardwired. Maybe you had, chips didn't come until a little bit later. But yeah, Magnus Odyssey and their line of Pong systems were notable. Home Pong from Atari, Coleco Telstar, and Nintendo also made their first system at around this time, color TV game sets. And they are Odyssey, Atari Home Pong, Coleco Telstar, and Nintendo color TV game. Okay, so this is the brown box prototype. This is the prototype that Ralph Baer tried to use to sell his video game idea. It's called TV game number 7. So, if at first you don't succeed, yada yada yada. There was no CPU, no programming at all. In order to change the game, you literally flipped up and down these switches. You had cards that told you which switches to flip to play a particular game. Came with 8 games: ping pong, checkers, golf, shooting, and 4 sports games, which probably meant more ping pong. All right, so is the brown box a digital device? This is a debate, that a lot of people talk about. No, it's not really digital. Yes, it is. Yada yada. Well, technically, it actually is. Even though it doesn't have a CPU, it doesn't have any ICs. It uses what's called diode transistor logic. You can do digital things with analog equipment. It's just a lot harder. There's a wonderful thing online called Pong Mechanic where a artist actually took a bunch of telephone relays and made Pong out of it. Even with no CPUs, and not even electronics, it's all mechanical, but it's digital. It's a digital device using electromechanical switches, which, when you talk about digital, you're basically talking about a bunch of switches, 0 or 1. All right, moving on. Magnus Odyssey, released in May 1972, cost $100, which would be over $650 today. So keep in mind when you're shopping for that PS5. Yeah, instead of switches, you change your game by putting in a plastic card, which basically changes the electronics on the inside, powered by C batteries or a power adapter. And so you didn't just play games on the TV, it came with paper money and poker chips and all these other accessories that you used to play the various games that were available on the Odyssey. And there was also a light gun peripheral for it as well. It's called the new electronic game of the future, your closed circle electronic playground. First peripheral light gun. If you bought a television set from Magnavox, it was $50. You got half off. Released in 12 countries, 350,000 of these guys were sold. Bless you. And now let's talk about a little company called Atari, founded in 1972. Nolan Bushnell, Ted Dabney. And it's a good thing we call it Atari because this is really hard to say. Sizzy G. Yes, these guys were from California. The Atari comes from the Japanese game of Go. It is the equivalent of check in chess when you're about to attack your opponent. And yeah, they've gone through some stuff. 76, it was sold to Warner Communications in order to produce the Atari VCS. 84 and 84, they separated out the arcade division. It was called Atari Games. 96 was kind of where the wheels finally came off. They were merged with JTS Storage. And yeah, nobody knows who they are. They just bought what was left. Hasbro Interactive on 98. Infogron in 2001. Now they're a separate company. And they're kind of in what I like to call the Fat Elvis period. Because, yeah, they're kind of just a shadow of their former self at this point. But moving on. Of course, we got to talk about Pong, engineered by Alan Acorn. There was a project that was given to him by the boss, Nolan Bushnell. That is actually the original Pong that they set up at Andy Capp's Tavern in California. And this is probably the first video game instructions ever. Avoid missing ball for high score. That was it. That was it. Funny story. So they installed this video game. People start playing it. A couple days later, the guys at Atari get a call from the tavern. It's like, hey, your machine already broke. Come and fix it. They're like, what happened? So they send the guy out to go look at the Pong machine. The reason the machine broke is because it was full of quarters. Yeah, people that pop so many quarters in that one hit the wrong thing. So good problem to have. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it from this picture. Yeah, there it is. There's the coin intake, which looks like one of those guys from like the little toy cars that you see in front of the grocery store that little kids ride. Yeah, good times. Okay, so was Pong the first arcade video game? Yes or no?
No.
Of course not. This was number 2. Number 1 was Computer Space, which was a version of the mainframe game Space War, which was a big thing on college campuses at the time that actually had computers. Probably one of the very, very first actual video games that you played on a screen that wasn't just text-based. Unfortunately, it was 1969, and it was too complicated for your average person. Which you got to remember, people had never. The only electronic devices most people were used to operating in this time period were televisions and radios. So they really weren't going to know what to make of this guy. Now his engineer friends loved it because they were nerds, but for the general public, they didn't get it. If you've ever seen the movie Soylent Green, there's actually one of these machines in the main character's apartments. So another little trivia bit for you. All right, now our first video game lawsuit, 1974, Magnavox versus Atari. As it turns out, fun thing, Nolan Bushnell stole Pong. Yeah, so when Atari came out with their version, Magnavox was like, wait a minute, this looks just like our game, we're going to sue you. And these are the actual patents that Baer used when he created the video game, television gaming and trading apparatus, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, it turns out Bushnell had actually seen the Magnus Odyssey at a Magnavox presentation and signed the guest book. So when they said prove it, Magnavox just pulled up the guest book and said, look, here's your name, you were at our thing, you saw our game, you copied our game, show us the money. And they did. Atari settled early on for $1.5 million, which in 1972 money, 74 money is a lot. And yeah, they kept up the lawsuits going through the mid-90s. So yeah, if you made a video game in the 1970s, Magnavox came and calling for you. Okay, so Atari's Home Pong, 1974, $100 or $543 in today's cash. Used a custom integrated circuit. Unlike the Odyssey, it had sound. It actually kept up score. This was the actual first home thing that Atari ever sold to the general public. And this guy up here is actually the Sears version. Sears and Atari were a thing. And this was the first product that they made kind of jointly together. Weirdly enough, video games back in the day, once again, this is a new thing. Nobody knows what to make of them. Sears sold them in the sporting goods department. Yeah, hilarious. Okay, so talking about our chips, this is the General Instrument AY38500. This was the Pong on a chip. So if you had a company, you did electronics, you wanted to make a Pong game, to try to sell because Pong's a big hot thing right now. You call General Instrument and say, hey, I want a bunch of these chips so I can make Pong games. There you go. You can now make your own Pong game. Contains 6 games and use it over 200 Pong clones, which would cause a problem. Okay, so another notable series was Magnus Odyssey series, first started in 1975. This basically had Pong, that's when the lawyers came to call them. 8 different models. Interesting to note, these little sliders up here, that's how you kept score. There was no score on the screen.
Oh, geez.
You had these little sliders on the front of the box. And then later on it came for scoring and life was good. So 8 different models. Coleco Telstar business. Coleco was originally a leather company. They went into video games. They had a number of these systems. This is an interesting one. It actually came with cartridges. You had driving game, shooting game, Pong game, of course. This one actually did use that General Instruments chip. They had a bunch of them over the 2 years. So that's our dedicated console era. They made all kinds of interesting things. This guy right here is Video Pinball from Atari. That's all it did. It played video pinball. I don't know if you can see the little buttons on the side, just like a pinball table. And then a gentleman by the name of Evel Knievel was kind of a thing at the time. They had this fun little stunt cycle game from Atari with motorcycle handlebars. You could try to jump over buses and things. But these were all, with the exception of this weirdo over here, these were all dedicated consoles. You played the game that were on the system, that was it. But let's be honest, Pong can go a really long way. Okay, and we had our first industry crash in 1977. So, with everybody and their cat making a Pong clone, eventually the party's over. The party started becoming over in 1976 when our second generation of consoles appeared, which had multiple games, which used cartridges. So why are you going to buy a box that can play just 5 or 6 games when you could buy an Atari or an Intellivision that can play a bunch of games? So just like any other crash, a lot of smaller companies got out of business. So this is our very, very first video game crash. Which brings us to the second generation. These are programmable consoles. Programmable meaning that they use cartridges. You can play all kinds of different games on them just by buying different cartridges and slapping it in. Now we're getting to a little bit more of the modern area where these guys are now starting to use central processing units, microprocessors. Notable consoles, Fairchild VES, Atari VCS and some television, Magnus Odyssey 2, and the Blackjack. That's our first console of the generation, the Fairchild VES. And the last one, the Activision Compact Vision TV Boy 1983, which I believe is a Japanese console. Okay, so let's talk about microprocessors a little bit. CPUs, they make computers smaller, faster, and more power efficient. Before these guys, you had to Do it the hard way with a bunch of, you've seen the old pictures, the big giant boxes of computer equipment, or you see an old movie from the 70s or 60s and they have the big giant boxes and all the flashy lights and the tape player spinning around. That's how you built the computer back then. Microprocessor made it a lot easier and a lot smaller. Fun thing, first microprocessor ever made, nobody knew about it because it was made for the Air Force, MP944. It was kept secret until 1998. It was made for the F-14 Tomcats. You got to remember, this was 1970. We weren't exactly playing nice with the Soviet Union, so a lot of the tech, this high-tech stuff, back then at least, hush-hush. The first commercially available processor that you could buy was Intel 4004 1971, which cost $60 or $378 in today's cash. You get a pretty decent CPU these days for $378. Just saying. All right, so our first system was Fairchild Video Entertainment System, released in August '76. Cost $170 or $769 in 2021 cash. And this is where we get to the fun part. You have your cell phone that's got a 1 gigahertz, 1 or 2 gigahertz CPU. It's got a gigabyte of, gigabytes of memory, gigabytes of RAM. Well, that dog didn't hunt back in the day. 1.78 megahertz. That's pretty darn slow. The amount of memory in the system, 64 bytes. A byte, in computer terms, a byte is literally like one letter. So you literally have like 64 characters of memory to work with, 2 kilobytes of video RAM. Resolution, 128 by 64. I don't even think that's a character in today's technology. 8 colors, audio playthrough console. Came with hockey and tennis. These were the cartridges, big and funky. Those of you who may have seen the Yellow Submarine Beatles movie, the artwork, kind of inspired by that. 27 video games made. Retail for $20 a pop or $90 in 2021 cash. Sold 400,000 over its lifetime. This being the first system, of course, it had a number of firsts. First system used cartridges. First one that had a pause button. There was a button on the system you could actually push to pause the game. So pretty advanced. First system to allow CPU opponent. Back then, especially in the Atari early games, nearly all the games were 2 players. Any one-player game, the few one-player games, sometimes the computer, there was a shooting game where the computer would basically just fire repeatedly, and if you hit more targets than the computer, hey, you won. But not really artificial intelligence. So this guy, you could play tic-tac-toe against the computer, which back then was a pretty big deal. The Atari came out, ECS, they renamed it to Channel F. Unfortunately, the Atari ultimately overcame it, sold the rights to the 1979, Fairchild got out of the business. Zircon re-released it as a Channel F system too, but for the most part it was game work for this guy. Okay, our next big system is the Odyssey 2, released in '78, cost $179 or $724. This one actually had an Intel CPU. This was marketed as a computer, like a home computer / video game system for your kids. One of the first ones to actually have a keyboard attached. 69 games released over the lifetime of the system, 2 million sales, which isn't too bad, but I read an old book on video games from back in the day, and it said that Atari was a cheeseburger, Intellivision was the fries, and Odyssey was the onion rings. So yeah, this was the HEB Cola to the diet, to the Coke and Pepsi of Atari and Intellivision. A little system that tried really hard.
It did.
Yeah, and you could learn programming via the computer intro cartridge and a 100-page manual. They actually had a thing for board games, role-playing games. There were role-playing games you could play with this Odyssey. It came with an actual board and tokens, and then you would use the video system to play certain bits. Came with a voice module. Games will talk to you. Cool thing. Weird thing is that nearly all the games were made by Magnavox themselves. Very few third-party games. Big in Europe. So this is pretty much the David Hasselhoff of the classic video game systems.
Question. I've got a question.
Yes.
How long would it usually take to make a game in those days?
That I'm not too sure about. That I'm not sure. From what I've heard, it was a few months, because back then the question was how long would it take to make a video game? And from what I've read, I believe it was not 100% sure, but I think it was like 5 or 6 months.
Depends how many people you have on your staff. 'Cause most of the time, the staff would be really small.
Yeah. But yeah, literally, it was just one or two person. One of the big things back then was that graphics weren't exactly a big thing yet. You know, so you didn't have to, you didn't quite have to have all these, you know, the army of people that it takes these days. Other question in the back?
Yeah, so you mentioned that there was very few third-party games. I thought these third-party games never arrived until like around the 80s when Activision.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there. You're on the right track. I hear you. Question was, you know, I thought third parties came around this time, and they did, and we're getting to that. So, good question. Incidentally, please hold your questions to the end of the presentation so I don't run out of time. Okay, Intellivision, released 1979. This was supposed to be the serious video game system. The very name means intelligent television. You know, add-on guys, they could turn it into a real computer with a cassette tape drive. Yeehaw. We're rocking at 2 megahertz now. And just over 1 kilobyte of RAM. So, yeah, really advanced stuff for the time. 118 games released. You know you're a serious game when your pack-in is Las Vegas poker and blackjack. Not exactly going for the kid crowd here. Sold 3 million, and notable things, this is the first system to seriously challenge the Muhammad Ali of gaming at the time, which was Atari. These controllers took a little getting used to. You know, maybe the first game pads, you know, depending on who you ask. But yeah, I mean, they took a little getting used to. You know, and in television, big thing back then was sports. You know, from the same book I referred to earlier, the guy was like, if you want to play space games, you want to shoot things, you buy an Atari. If you want to play sports games, you buy an Intellivision. Also came with a voice module. Mattel got out of video games after the crash, sold the rights to INTV Corp. A lot of the Intellivision games were made by the same team. They were known as the Blue Sky Rangers. I believe they have an online presence if you want to check those guys out. That's the Intellivision. Like I said, it was a pretty good system. Like I said, if you get over the funky controllers, it definitely had its moments. And then we get to our big guy, the Atari VCS, the 2600, released 1977 for $200. 128 bytes of RAM. That's almost the full page of text. Came with Combat, which is super fun to play. If you're gonna play one game from this generation, play Combat. It's freaking awesome. Play tanks with bouncy missiles are the best. One of the first systems that allowed you to play with 4 people. Came with paddles. Came with 2 paddles. You bought another pair, plugged it in. You play games with 4 people. Pretty cool. And this is simultaneously an awesome thing and a terrible thing. 565 games released for this system. Over the course of about, you know, most of them were released before the crash, so over the course of about 6 years, that's almost 100 games a year. These days, that's a good thing. Back then, when you're starting off, it ended up not being a good thing. Lifetime sales, 30 million. So yeah, compare that to 3 million for the Intellivision, 2 million for the Odyssey. You know, this was the guy. And because Atari played nice with Sears, we also had a Sears version. I actually had this one. This was my first video game system back in the day. When Nintendo came out and started selling boatloads of units, they re-released the 2600 as in a super compact size. The advertising at the time said, the fun is back for $50. You know, so why buy a brand new Nintendo Entertainment System when you can get at that point, 9-year-old Atari for $50? Needless to say, it didn't go that well. The most popular second-gen system. If you're a programmer, you're a masochist, this is the system for you. One of the hardest systems to program for because you literally have to work around the way a television works and the way it's drawn on the screen. If you notice on an Atari game, there's always like black bars and black lines and stuff on the left side of the screen. That's where the game data is.
That's where they're holding.
Really weird, really bizarre. Introduced to the National Toy Hall of Fame in 2007, so this was the big deal at the time. A lot of you growing up, you know, maybe your parents referred to video games as Nintendo. Well, before that, video games, if you're a child in the 70s and in the 80s particularly, video games were just Atari. That's when you know you made it. And then Atari's other big competitor was Coleco Vision. Cost $175, so we're just under the cost of a PS3 or PS5 now. Released in 1982. Coleco's thing was arcade conversions. This is their version of Donkey Kong, and this is what Donkey Kong basically sold a lot of home systems for Coleco. You know, that's a pretty funky controller with the joystick and the keypad and buttons on the side. 138 released, over 2 million in sales. These guys actually, in terms of game quality, these guys were it. Yeah, superior arcade conversions. Also had a lot of add-ons. One fun thing that the other video game companies like to do was release an add-on for their system that let you play Atari games. Think about how insane that is. You know, if Nintendo were to come out with a thing that let you play Xbox games, you know, on a Switch.
Oh, they had that. Or the Nintendo and Sega. They did have a bootleg system that was hard to come by.
Yeah. Yeah, but back then, and here's the thing with these home systems, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, was that these were all literally just generic off-the-shelf components. There was nothing custom. You know, and we'll get to why that was a bad idea later. But to be fair, everything was new. Another interesting thing about this particular system is that this influenced the creation of the NES. One of the guys that worked for Nintendo bought one of these home to his family. And he played the games, and he saw that they were wonderful and really close to the arcade counterparts. And I'm like, man, this is the kind of system that Nintendo should make. Let me get the gentleman's name. It's on my laptop, which ordinarily would be closer. Yeah, Takao Sawano, chief manager of the NES project, bought ColecoVision home to his family. Masayuki Umura, head of Famicom development, stated that ColecoVision set the bar for what Nintendo wanted to do with their system. So this guy helped give us the NES a number of years later. Now to illustrate how we got from the arcade to the home, I'm going to use Donkey Kong, which was a big thing back then. This is the arcade version of Donkey Kong. We know it, we love it. Gave us Mario, who back then was a carpenter, not a plumber. A little trivia there. Yeah, the plumbing thing actually came with Mario Brothers, not Super Mario Brothers. Anyway, yeah, this is the arcade game. And I apologize for the next image, the next few images. They're going to hurt your eyeballs. This is an Atari version of Donkey Kong. Yeah. Yeah, as a kid, I thought the barrels looked like lemons. Moving up to the Intellivision, a little bit better, but, you know, we're not quite there yet. And now the ColecoVision, which is legit. You know, Mario looks like Mario. You know, and like I said, this is what sold a lot of ColecoVision, was that, hey, you can play Donkey Kong at home and it's just like the arcade with all the sounds and the graphics, and it's wonderful. Okay, so we go to Atari's next system, which was the Super System in 1982, $270. They laid an egg with this one. This is just terrible. When your packing game is Super Breakout, and also this one and the Intellivision had the contest of probably the worst controllers ever made. Yeah, 2 terrible joysticks. 69 games released for the system, over 1 million sold. You know that thing when you have a joystick and you pull it, you let go of it, and the joystick springs back to the middle? These guys didn't do that.
Oh no.
Yeah, and that's why they were awful. Yeah, if you pull.
They were.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, if you pull it to the right and you let it go, it just sat there. Which, yeah, is, I've actually tried, yeah, I actually played these back in the day, and they were just terrible. But, you know, they had 4 controller ports, so you could play 4 people. This was actually, I believe it was an Atari 800 on the inside. Used the same hardware. A lot of the computer games that Atari made showed up on this system, but it didn't run any computer software. Yeah, analog joysticks were terrible. A lot of the games were simply 2600 games with better graphics. Didn't play 2600 games, which was kind of a thing. Didn't make a lot of people back then. Atari itself was more focused on 2600 because people were buying it, and so they kind of gave up on this one pretty quickly. And once again, controllers sucked. Alright, so those are our main systems. We're going to talk about some of the firsts from the golden age of video games, and some of these are probably going to surprise you. Especially this first one, our first survival horror game. Haunted House in 1982. Yeah, this was the, you were literally a pair of eyeballs that wandered through a haunted house, and you had to find pieces. I had this game, by the way, which was great. Yeah, you had to find pieces of an urn while being pursued by 3 spiders, and 3 spiders, a ghost, and a bat. And if they approached you, you would hear wind sounds. And for being, an Atari from 1976, the wind and lightning sounds on this were actually pretty darn good for the time. If you can, it's like I said, for the day, it was really good, and I think certainly the sound effects hold up well today. But yeah, 1982, our first survival horror game, Haunted House. First licensed game, Space Invaders. Space Invaders was huge back in the day in the arcades. 600 million in Japan. Allegedly, it caused shortages of the 100 yen coin because people were popping in Space Invaders machines. So Atari said, hey, they signed a check over to Teo, released their own version of Space Invaders, released it in 1980, and quadrupled the sales of their consoles. This made it the very first killer app in the consumer space. First Atari game, first video game to sell 1 million copies. Like I said, Space Invaders was a big deal. And so once this guy sold well, Atari started licensing other arcade games to sell more systems. First action-adventure game, Superman for the 2600, released in '79, along the same time as the movie. May have also been the first licensed home video game. Early single-player game, remember a lot of 2600 games were 2-player. First game with multiple screens, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but yeah. Also had a pause feature. And the first one that you could actually finish. Most games back in the day, you played it until if you're playing a 2-player game, you played until the time ran out. Or if you're playing a single-player game, you play until you inevitably run out of lives or get bored. First fantasy game, Adventure. This one is very well known. Late '79 by William Robinette. Inspired by the text mainframe game Colossal Cave Adventure. Also sold 1 million copies. 30 screens. Also gave us the first home video game Easter egg, where Mr. Robinette put his name in the game. 4 kilobytes of code made up this game. Mattel, once again, their thing was sports, so they actually went out and wrote checks to Major League Baseball, NFL football, soccer, basketball, and sold a bunch of sports games because that was their thing. Which leads us to the first console war, Mattel versus Atari, and this was brutal. George Clinton, famous sports writer, was hired by Intellivision and said, hey, we want you to tell people how awesome our system is and how terrible the other guys are. And so this is an actual ad. That's the guy, and these are actual screenshots of the Atari baseball game and the Intellivision baseball game. And they did a lot of TV ads where Henry Thomas from E.T. popped up in one. And the guy's literally telling you, here, look at their game. It sucks. Here, look at our game. It's awesome. Ours looks like real basketball. Theirs doesn't. So. Yeah, of course, about 10 years afterwards, we'd see a repeat with Nintendo and Sega, but the old guy started first. First God game, Utopia on the Intellivision. Dan Daglow, 1981. This was a 2-player game. You had to build a better island than your opponent. Partially real time. This is way before Civilization and SimCity came along. Featured the Art of Games at Smithsonian. So, and that's the thing. That's the thing you got to remember about this time period, is that everything was new. So it's like, hey, if you want to try something different and out there, why not? First in-game announcer, first save cartridge, Major League Baseball for the Intellivision in '83. Now, in order to get the announcer and the save data, you had to have a computer system for the Intellivision and the voiceover add-on. So you're talking about You know, probably about $800 worth of stuff, you know, to play baseball. But, you know, that's actually pretty good for the time period. You know, that could be, you know, that the way it looks is very similar to what you see these days in baseball games. And some of the programs on this side, Don DeGlow and Eddie Dunbar, will go on to start Electronic Arts. Play cable, play games at home over your cable system, started by Mattel and General Instrument. For their Intellivision, you pay so much dollars a month. And you can play all the games you could play on your Intellivision, just download them over the cable. 20 games available, $20 a month. Unfortunately, the modem only contained 8K of RAM, so once bigger games, 16K games came out, you couldn't play them because they literally would not fit on the machine. Discontinued in '83, so some of you may remember the Sega channel. This was very similar to that. First sequel game, Cosmo Card. Yeah, this was the part 2 of a game called Atlantis. Atlantis, you're basically destined to lose the game. And at the end of the game, you see a little spaceship fly off, so hey, let's make another game with the spaceship, you know, doing the Noah's Ark thing, picking up alien animals, yada yada, and then, but inevitably you will lose this game, and then you see another little spaceship fly off, but they went out of business and never made a third game. Oh well. And a big thing back in the day was there weren't a lot of people that could program video games. And so companies did not want their programmers to leave. You know, they don't want them to get hired off by their competition. So they were very big on keeping their identity of their programmers a secret. And so programmers got like 0 credit for any of the games that they did. Oh, they didn't get any money either. 4 programmers at Atari accounted for 60% of Atari sales in 1978. They got no extra money for this. I think I have more notes on my screen that I can read off to you. Yeah, in early 1979, Atari's marketing department created a memo that showed their best-selling cartridges to try to motivate their employees. David Crane, one of the Activision founders, noted that the games that he had worked on had generated over $20 million in revenue for Atari. You know how much Mr. Crane made in a year? He made 20 grand, which isn't bad for 1983, don't get me wrong, but when you make 20 grand and your work makes the company 20 million, come on, man. And so this would lead to our third parties. And also, this is also why Mr. Robinette hid his name in Adventure, because he wanted you to know that I made this game, Dagon. Also, when Electronic Arts came along, one of the things that they wanted to do differently was treat their programmers as artists, as creative people. You know, these are like our rock stars. You know, we want them to get credit. We want them to be happy. Of course, this was way before they became the evil empire we all know and love today. Okay, and this leads us to our first third-party developer, Activision. Started on October 1st, 1979 by 4 of Atari's top game programmers that I just mentioned, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, Larry Kaplan, and Alan Miller. Once again, these video game systems did not have any lockout systems like we know today. So if you wanted to make an Atari game and you knew how, you could. But nobody had actually tried it until these guys came along. Of course, when you try to do something like this, here come the lawyers. Atari did sue Activision once they got the ball rolling. They weren't able to put them out of business, though Activision did have to pay them some money to make games for the Atari. They were able to stay in business and make their own games. And I don't know if you can see from this previous slide, but on the back of every Activision box had the name of the guy or gal that made the game. This was a big deal, because otherwise they got no credit. But yeah, they got their name on the back of the box. On the cartridge, if you read the instruction manual, they actually got like 1 or 2 pages to actually tell you something. Say, hey, I made this game. You know, check it out. Yada yada. And every game had like a goal, like a high score, something that you could reach. And if you hit that score, or beat that time, what have you, you take a picture of your Polaroid camera, send it to Activision, and they will send you a patch. All right, next video game lawsuit. Atari versus Philips, the creators of the Odyssey and Odyssey 2 in 1981. Magnavox released KC Munchkin. Atari had paid for Pac-Man from Namco, but they hadn't made the game yet. That sad incident would come later. Magnavox won the initial trial, but on appeal, the court determined that you cannot copyright gameplay. But if your game contains elements that are too similar to the other guy, that's where you're gonna get into trouble. And so if you look at Casey Munchkin, you can't tell from this screenshot, but when he walks to the side, he's walking like Pac-Man. These guys look an awful lot like Ghost Monsters from Pac-Man. And that's probably what cost them the lawsuit. And so yeah, this for that reason, this picture, Magnavox game is a little on the rare side because they had to pull it off the market in 1982. Fun times. All right, let's talk about some of our gaming pioneers. Larry Lawson, one of the few black people in the early video game industry. Member of the Homebrew Computer Club, which was a computer club in California, which featured a bunch of guys that started computer companies or became big in the industry. Steve Wozniak of Apple was a member. You know, so a lot of Stephen Osborne, I believe, he started the Osborne Computer Company, was also a member. Yeah, Homebrew Computer Club was kind of a big thing. Like I said, a lot of the guys that gave us computer companies and technology came from there. He was one of the few black members, part of the team that created the Fairchild VES and gave us cartridges. And now some women in the early industry. Donna Bailey, the only woman in Atari's Point-Out division. She would go on to help design Centipede. And Carol Shaw, creator of River Raid, one of the early vertical shooters, and one of the first female game designers at Atari. So yeah, there's some of our early pioneers from the early days. Okay, now let's get to the really fun part, the crash. What the heck happened? This is actually from a wonderful documentary on Netflix called Atari Game Over. They go over the whole ET thing, which I'll gloss over in a bit. Watch it, it's wonderful, it's great. Okay, so in 82, video games were rocking. $3.2 billion of revenue, and that's in 82 dollars, so life was good. And then Activision came along. They won their lawsuit. They were legally allowed to make Atari 2600 games. So a boatload of games came out. Home computers started becoming less expensive. And so, you know, why are you going to spend money on a video game system when you could buy a home computer for your child and have them, you know, learn computers and play video games? Yeah, pretty much everybody got out of the business after the crash. Mattel, Magnavox, and Coleco gone. Yeah, look at this. From 82, we had $3.2 billion in revenue. By 85, 100 million. If that ain't a crash, I don't know what is. What happened? Number one, too many consoles. In 82, 9 consoles for sale. Atari 2600, 5200, Odyssey 2, the Television, Coleco Vision, Channel F, Valley Astrocade, Arcadia 2001, and the Vectrix. They got too much supply and not enough demand. Too many third parties. Once again, Activision won their lawsuit, and now anybody can make an Atari game. And so some, you know, not so happy programmers would leave to start their own companies. And Magic in particular was the second third party company. June of 1982, we had 100 cartridges. By December of that same year, 400 cartridges were available for sale. Yeah, David Crane once said that from one consumer electronics show to the next, at one show they had 3 companies making video games. At the next show they had 30.
Ooh.
So yeah, it was a big thing. Everybody wanted to make money, but once again, too many games. And why do I have this game on the screen? Okay, well, this is Towering Inferno from US Games, and this illustrates, I use this as an illustration of how insane things were at the time. You know who owns US Games? The Quaker Oats Company. Captain Crunch, yes.
Oatmeal and cereal.
Yeah, people that made breakfast cereal started video game companies. That's how insane this was. Too many terrible games. You know, a company called Mystique even tried making adult video games. You want to talk about using your imagination, yeah. there were so many bad games, and I personally remember this. This is actually a small example. This is actually from the National Video Game Museum up in not Plano, Frisco. Yes, thank you. Yeah, up in Frisco, Texas, National Video Game Museum. They actually have a little section dedicated to the crash. This is part of that exhibit. Those of you who remember KB Toys and Games, they had giant freaking bins like this, probably like at least 4 times the size of this thing, just full of $5 video games. Which, if you were a kid, was awesome. I get new games for $5, sweet. You know? But if you're a company and you're trying to sell these things for $40 a pop, it ain't happening. Yeah, it ain't happening, because why is somebody going to buy your, you know, super fancy, nice Atari or Activision video game for $40, but they go to the bargain bin and get 8 for $5 a pop? Yeah, Atari's market share from 70% in '81 to about 40% in '82. So a lot of bad games were sold. And of course, yeah, Atari laid a few eggs. I mentioned the 5200 earlier. Pac-Man and E.T. cost them millions of dollars in licensing, damaged their reputation, said, hey, this game is going to be awesome, it's going to be wonderful, you should buy a bunch of copies, you can sell it in your store. Nobody bought them, or they got returned. So in '83, Atari reported a loss of $500 million. And that ain't going to keep you in business. Oh yeah, Pac-Man. It's like, hey, Space Invaders worked out really good, let's pay for Pac-Man. And they did. They hired one of the programmers, Todd Fire, did it in 5 months. You're talking about how long it takes to make a game. 5 months is apparently not long enough. Yeah, released in March of 1982. This actually became the packing game for the 2600 Rapid Combat. And so everybody wanted to sell Pac-Man. Atari made 12 million copies of this game. Lifetime they sold 30 million, but at the time there were only about 8 or 9 million systems in the wild. They thought that this was going to sell 2600s, and it almost worked. That's selling the Atari game. We're selling over 7 million copies sold, but as anybody who has played it knows, not a good game. Not a good game. To this day, I still hear that noise. I still hear the eating noise. Whenever you think, actually, if you look at television shows from the 80s, when somebody's playing a video game or doing something at a computer, you'll either hear the noise from the arcade game Centipede, or you'll hear the dang, da dang, 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 dang from the Atari Pac-Man. Wonderful thing. And E.T., oh boy. In June of 1982, Spielberg's E.T. was a smash hit at the box office, over $600 million. Atari paid $25 million for the license. It took Howard Scott Warshaw. Now, in Warshaw's defense, this guy did know how to make a good game. He made Yard's Revenge, which is an excellent 2600 game. Atari wanted to get this guy out in time for Christmas. The guy did it in 5.5 weeks. There's the infamous pit that you love falling into playing the game. I don't know if I should admit this, but I actually know how to finish this game. This may have been the first major video game bomb, and also one of the first games made from a movie. Also, home computers are becoming a thing. These days, we have Apple, we have PCs, Microsoft. Back in the day, you can get a computer from Commodore, Radio Shack, Texas Instruments, Apple, Timex Sinclair. Good times. But once again, these guys got cheaper. The Timex Sinclair 1000 down here was $100. Commodore's got down to like $200 for a home computer. Back then, you plugged it to your television set. Your TV set was your monitor. Good times. But these took away from sales of video games. You could program a computer, learn to do computer things, do business things. And actually, Commodore 64 was actually a really good game machine back in the day. And the burial, yes. I remember hearing this back in the day about the ET cartridges buried in the desert, allegedly trucked from El Paso, New Mexico in the dead of the night, and crushed with a steamroller buried in concrete. Atari Game Over Izzy documentary, they actually found the games. The process by which they found the games is pretty bonkers. They actually found like an old picture from a newspaper report, got a guy that basically knew the dump like the back of his hand. Said, "Oh yeah, that picture from 30 years ago. Yeah, that's over there. That's where you're gonna look." It's literally how they found them. About 700,000 games. One of these was actually put in the Smithsonian. Okay, so by 1995, game over, man. $100 million in sales. Gone. We started going to computers and arcades, because people were still playing games in arcades. Good times. Dominance would flip over to Japan, thanks to a little company called Nintendo back in 1985 when they released the NES. That'll be part 2. And to keep this from happening again, Nintendo instituted a lockout chip so that not anybody could make Nintendo games, even though, spoiler alert, they actually did. But that'll be for next time. But the wonderful Nintendo seal of quality was basically, hey, this is our official game with our lockout chip. It's great, unless it's made by LJN. And yeah, that was their thing. They wanted to prevent a glut of terrible video games that doomed, the Atari and all those guys. And that's it. So, hope you liked it. Hope you liked it. Any questions, observations? No?
Covered some different stuff than my teacher did.
Yeah? Well, I mean, this is...
We watched that video that we were talking about in my class.
Oh, the game over thing?
Yeah.
No, it's great. It's wonderful. I love it. Yeah, game over on
Netflix?
on Netflix. I believe it's on Netflix or Amazon.
I think he was streaming it, so I'm not sure which one it was.
But it's on streaming. And like I said, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to watch. There was also another documentary, a series of documentaries actually. Golly, I forget what it's called. That one was, I think, is on Netflix. I'm trying to remember what it's called. But it was really good. They go a lot of High Score. Thank you. High Score, yes. Documentary. That one's on Netflix, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, High Score series of documentaries on Netflix. If you want to learn more about this early stuff, they talk to a lot of these guys. Now I'm curious. I gotta look up where this guy came from. But yeah, if you want to play some of these games, there's a wonderful emulator for the Atari 2600 called Stella, which was actually the nickname of the chip that was in the Atari. Yeah, Stella is a Atari 2600 emulator. ROMs are pretty easy to find. No, not a wink, wink. You didn't hear that from me.
It's not Atari age, don't worry.
Yeah.
They're not as
Oh, they're busy making terrible systems.
NFTs, hotels, you name it.
Yeah. Where is it?
If you don't here, try to take a look at what's going on with television.
Yeah, I'm trying to find where this thing is.
Red has online clubs, so he was streaming it through the Zoom, so I don't know if he had it like on YouTube or something.
Well, I know it's on streaming. I just don't know exactly where, who's got it.
Hang on, I think
Okay, yeah, it is on Netflix.
yeah, that's what.
Yeah, it is on Netflix. I was gonna say, where's the...
Wait, it says it was.
Oh, it was? Oh, well.
And it's usually on Showtime, but I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure somebody's uploaded it to YouTube.
Probably on YouTube by now.
But yeah, like I said, my next project is to do another panel, but talking about the 8 and the 16-bit eras, which would be, which I'm sure is the one that everybody's going to be like.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
Really? That I'm not sure about. I haven't even got the thing done yet. So yeah. Nah, I want to do it. Because the one thing I particularly want to shock people over are Nintendo's business practices.
They started
Man.
as a car company. Most people
Yeah, they're
don't
bad.
know.
Man, they could give Microsoft lessons in being bad. Some of the stuff they did back in the 80s. There's a wonderful book called Guidebook Press Start Continue, which is about the history of Nintendo. And yeah, they did some shady stuff back then.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much put the PC Engine out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I really like your presentation. It was informative.
Oh, thank you. Try to keep things good.